This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so thank you for joining us this afternoon for our fourth Babcock Mathematics Research Talk. And this afternoon, as you know, I'm going to be talking about our research that we did around supporting active and influential participation through the use of pre-teaching and assigning competence. So I'm going to share with you some of what we found with our research, which ran over a couple of years. So the first thing I'm going to start with is something that one of the pupils in our first year of our project said to me. I hate maths, it's boring. And then they said, it's not boring when there's been a pre-teach. If there hasn't, it's boring because I don't know what I'm doing. And we had a little bit of a discussion about what they were meaning by boring, and what they meant was they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what was going on in the lesson. They didn't know how they were supposed to participate. They didn't really know what their place was in the lesson. But what they had found was that the pre-teach helped them to find their place and to know what they were doing. And then suddenly maths wasn't boring anymore. And it was quite interesting, this use of the word boring, because that was the language that they had for describing their experience. So the starting point for our research was really current maths education landscape and findings from our own action research projects. So in terms of the maths education landscape, this was really the sort of emergence of teaching for mastery as sort of driven through NCETM's work, and what was being looked at around teaching for mastery. We also then, as we started to look at things, found there was limited research into pre-teaching and mathematics. And we also had been looking at assigning competence. So I'll just sort of pick apart those for you now, starting with the mastery. As teaching for mastery was sort of, as I say, emerging as a key area in maths education, and particularly in primary, we went back and said, so where has this come from? What's the origin of it? And so we went back to Bloom from the 1960s. And I'll just give you an opportunity to read. I've got two slides I think are very useful in terms of thinking about both teaching for mastery and then also what we were looking at with pre-teaching and assigning competence. So we know children are always going to come into school with different experiences. They're not going to have the same experiences. But if they leave school with the gap between their experiences still being the same as the gap between their experiences when they come into school, we haven't really done our jobs in schools. And I love this bit about finding strategies which will take individual differences into consideration, but which will do so in such a way as to promote the fullest development of the individual. I mean, that's quite a challenge, but it does seem really what we should be about in education. And then here's the second quote from this Bloom article. Again, I'll give you a chance to read that. And again, I think there's a couple of things in this that are worth pulling out that we certainly attended to, and we had a lot of conversations around. First of all, there's an underlying belief here that everybody can learn. Everybody in this case can learn the mathematics, and I'm not certain that we have a shared belief around that runs throughout our education system at the moment. And certainly I'm not sure that runs through our sort of society. But I put the bit in bold because this seemed to be the thing that was particularly pertinent to what we were thinking about, and very challenging for schools. Given time enough, all students can conceivably attain mastery of a learning task. But the given time enough is the challenge. How do we give time enough, and in what form do we give time enough? And that's what we started to look at. And then we looked at that in conjunction with what was emerging from NCETM at this time, and particularly around talking about intervention in relation to mastery. And we've got a little quote there from 2014 and one from 2016. And in both of those, the notion of same-day intervention coming after a lesson are being talked about. And that was very much the thrust that we were hearing from the National Centre, was the notion that intervention should be happening very quickly, if possible on the same day. So after children have had a lesson, if they you know, there's things that they didn't really understand, they need to get those children together and work on it with them. And that's very much based on the sort of Shanghai approach. Of course, there are some big differences between here and Shanghai. So in Shanghai, it is the person that's taught the mathematics in the lesson who then does that same day intervention. And that was not something that I saw schools looking at as they started to look at same day intervention here. But it seemed to us that there was possibly an alternative to this, and it could still be seen as same day intervention, but you put it before the lesson rather than after the lesson. And this has started emerging from some of our other action research projects as a tool that some teachers were using, this idea of pre-teaching. And it wasn't a feature of those projects, but what we were noticing across all of the teachers that were using it was how positive they were and how much they talked about the impact, very positively about the impact. So we looked around for existing research into pre-teaching, and particularly pre-teaching mathematics, and didn't really find much. And that was one of the reasons we thought we really needed to run a project. We did use this article, which is One Teacher's Viewpoint by Minkel from 2015. Again, I'll let you read that quote. And we use this reading as quite a key sort of starting point with the groups that was in the project, because we felt they needed to have that sort of a teacher's view of the difference it can make and why this is quite different to other interventions that they might have used in the past. So this idea of actually changing the way the child sees themselves in the classroom seemed to be really, really important. There is some other research around pre-teaching and mathematics. And so Lally and Miller, this is quite an interesting one where they compared the impact of pre-teaching and reteaching. So intervention before, intervention after. And they found that it had a similar impact on performance. But interestingly, pre-teaching was the only one that had an impact on confidence and motivation. And I'm going to suggest those are quite important for performance in the long run. So whilst we might be looking at performance in the short term and the change, when you're starting to look at engagement and performance in the long run, confidence and motivation are absolutely crucial. So that was quite interesting that was coming up from that research. So we had teaching for mastery and the suggestion from NCETM about same-day intervention. And then we started having pre-teaching emerging from our action research projects, but finding very, very little research into it. And then another thing we've been looking at was this whole notion of assigning competence. And this comes from the work from Cohen and others. And this model is in Jo Bowler's book, but she is building this on work from Cohen around complex instruction. And complex instruction is all about equity in the classroom. And Cohen and others identified these 4 different elements. And one of those you can see is assigning competence. And we really picked up on this bit. So again, I think there's a really important thing to notice here is that complex instruction is about creating equitable classrooms. I'm not sure that everybody that we work with in schools has a belief in equitable classrooms. So I think there's a real challenge there to even have that discussion around what we mean by equitable classrooms and how we might be going about establishing those. But that's very much what the work of Cohen and others is focused on. So they looked at this and they've got these 4 elements, and assigning competence is about addressing particularly the low status of students. And the 2 quotes you've got there have come from teachers on our project, how they started to view assigning competence. But really one of the things that Cohen and others said was that unless you address the status of students and the status of low status students in lessons, all the other things are not going to make a difference. We need to address that low status. And this is where we came to with our idea that it's about children being participating and being influential. And it's the influential part of that comes from the assigning competence. Because when we observe low status children in maths lessons, they're not being listened to. Their ideas are not being taken and built on by anybody, and then they sort of start to sit back and they stop participating as well. And this sort of status shift was quite, we saw it as being important. you could address assign competence to anybody, but their attention, Cohn and Lotan looked at the fact that you're trying to boost the participation of low status students without reducing the participation of high status students. It didn't have a negative impact. This is one of the really powerful things that they found in their work. There are some really important things about assigning competence, and one of the things I'll say now and I'll say it again is that it was the part of our project that teachers struggled with the most, and we struggled with the most, and I would say we are still developing our thinking around assigning competence, because it's a very nuanced thing, and it's something that is you have to sort of spend time really thinking about how that's working in the classroom, and it's about viewing your class differently and viewing the individuals in your class differently. And Cohen has recommended that if you're going to address status, then if you're going to bring attention to something a pupil is offering, it's got to be public, intellectual, specific and relevant. So one of the things it's quite easy to do when you're trying to assign competence, I might draw attention to something that someone said, but if it's not relevant to what we're doing at the moment, or if it's not actually helping us with our learning, it's not intellectual. The rest of us already all know this, but you're drawing attention to it just because that person said it. It does not raise status. In fact, it can backfire, and it can actually have a negative impact on status. So those elements, public, intellectual, specific and relevant to the group task, are important, and they are things that are quite difficult to sort of really weave into the thinking of what's happening in a lesson when you're looking at this. And as I said, we continue to find it quite challenging. So this is one of the reasons why we focused on the teacher of the maths lesson also being the teacher for the pre-teach, because we had brought these two elements together. So whilst there's some research on assigning competence and there's some research on pre-teaching, those two things were existing separately, but we saw that there was an opportunity here that if you brought the two together, you could have a much greater impact, because that notion of giving children some time before a lesson so that they can engage better in the lesson with the person who is teaching the lesson, that person is then in a better position to assign competence and to notice those learners during the lesson. And we just felt those two things sat really well together, and we really wanted to explore that. So our report from the first year is out. We have sort of started doing like an additional bit from the second year, but it really sort of found the same as the first year on the whole. There was just some additional things that in the second year we looked whole school, but in the first year we were working with a group of teachers from 17 schools across Devon. And this is what we were looking at doing: supporting children to be active and influential participants in mathematics lessons. That's what we wanted from it. Our tools were using assigning competence and pre-teaching. So assigning competence and pre-teaching were our tools. Our goal was that the children would be active and influential participants. We had to keep bringing teachers back to that aim, and ourselves, that was our aim. The aim wasn't to run pre-teaching sessions and to assign competence. The aim was to ensure that we had classrooms full of children who were active and influential participants in lessons. So that was our research question. The project, we had funding, as you can see, from most of it was from Devon County Council, but we had some from the Jurassic Maths Hub and some from CODE Maths Hub through the research grants. And because a big focus for Devon was on disadvantaged children at the time, we made that a focus as well. So teachers working on the project chose 3 focused children for the year. And we asked them if they could to think about vulnerable or disadvantaged children for those children. We had classes ranging from year 1 to year 6. We had more children from the year 3, 4, middle part, but we did have children coming right across from year 1 to year 6. When we had a second year, we stepped it up, because in those we had 2 or 3 teachers from a school working with us. When we did the second year, we involved whole schools, and we also had therefore some foundation stage involved to look at whether it was appropriate there and how it was appropriate. And we were then looking at how schools best use pre-teaching assigning competence, because if you're going to start thinking about intervention differently, and you're going to be wanting teachers to be involved in that intervention, and it's going to happen before lessons, there's quite a big sort of demand on senior leaders to think about how they're going to support that, on timetabling, on how you're freeing people up to do that. And when we were working with pairs of teachers in schools, with those pairs, those teachers were very on board with what they're doing, and they managed it themselves and they sort of made it work. But in the long run, and if you're going to scale that up, you need to look at it at a school level, which is why we did that. Most of what I'm going to share with you today comes from that very sort of detailed look with the teachers in the first year. So when we're thinking about the impact, teachers and children involved said that the combination of those strategies had a positive effect, both on the levels of participation and the ability of those learners who've been involved as the focus children to be influential in lessons. And for many of the children, not all, this was over 1 year we were working on it. And when you've got children, it's not going to close all the gaps. That's not what it's going to do. But for many of those children, it allowed them access to age-appropriate mathematics. And there it had a positive impact on their attainment in tests. So you've got that thing that you're getting access to the age-appropriate mathematics that previously you might not have been able to access in the lesson. The child at the beginning, it's boring, I don't know what I'm doing. Suddenly I've got access to it, which means I'm actually learning in the lessons, and therefore that actually is quite a huge difference to what was going on for some of these children. And this is one child summing up of the difference it made for her. Oh, sorry, that's not the child summing up. This is summing up from one of us first. Yeah, for me, and I'd say there was a team of us working on this, but for me, of all of our research projects we've done, this is the one that I felt had the biggest impact and was amazing, watching the impact that teachers were having on children who had quite fixed beliefs about themselves as learners in mathematics, and how they managed to change that, even with Year 6 children. And this is the Year 6 child I wanted to show. Her teacher asked her, what would a lesson look like without pre-teaching? And she had joined the school in Year 5. They had been really quite concerned about her when she joined. And so she was one of the focus children. And this was coming towards the end of Year 6. She was asked this question. And this was her response, which I think it's a fantastic response. First of all, I'm going to tell you as a teacher, you haven't asked me the right question. For her, if you read that response, she did not limit the impact of that to her maths lessons in Year 6. She saw the impact of it as how she was feeling about leaving primary and going to secondary, and that had changed her own view of herself as a learner, being able to cope in secondary school. And she left that primary school without worrying about going to secondary, and the teachers weren't worried about her going to secondary either. And so she joined secondary in a very different place than where she had been a year earlier. And for me, I think that's a phenomenal impact to have on an individual. That's going to stay with her throughout her life. That was a real sort of turning point for her. I showed you earlier the sort of extracts from NCETM when they were talking in 2014 and 2016 about mastery and intervention, and very much talking about it coming after the lessons and same day. One of the impacts of the research that we did, and the fact that it was partly funded by the Maths Hubs, is that it did filter through the whole sort of Maths Hub and the NCETM system. So much so that the PowerPoints that have now been put together to go with the non-statutory guidance all have this slide in them where they say that the activities can be used, well, in the context of pre-teaching. So pre-teaching has become part of the language. And this was another reason for us wanting to do this talk, because one of the things that concerns me is that people see pre-teaching and they think, oh, we know what that is and we know how to make that work. But they may not have looked at the research. And certainly there are some really clear things that came from our research. I had somebody email me very recently and say, we're going to start doing pre-teaching, but we're not doing it with teachers, we're doing it with teaching assistants. Have you got any advice? And I said, I can't advise you because I haven't done any research with teaching assistants doing it. Our research is all about the impact with teachers. So that is our first finding, and it is a finding that is the most important finding of all. That for it to have the impact it had in our project, it has to be run by the class teacher. And there's a whole number of layers to this. And I think, again, we may have anticipated some of it, but we certainly didn't anticipate all. And we felt like we were peeling back layers of this. And I still think as I examine it, I see more and more in it. But there is, the children first of all value that extra bit of time because it's with their class teacher. So there's something here about the status of the intervention itself. And I'm going to have some teachers talking about this who are on our project in a moment, and I think they might mention this. But we've also got this relationship that happens between the children that are in the group. And I said there are 3 focus children with the class teacher. They're coming together regularly. They get to know each other better. They take that relationship into the classroom. They know they've had those shared experiences in the pre-teach. They take those into the classroom. They've now got shared references, which they take with them into the classroom, into that whole class lesson. And I think the teachers viewed the children differently because they've got a different relationship with them. And then that view goes into the classroom as well. So I'm just going to hopefully play a little bit of video for you. So one moment while I just change over.
But what was brilliant as well is the way we planned for it had the knock-on effect of raising the status of pre-teaching, because the amount of children that would come up to me and go, am I coming to this group? Can I come to this group now? Because of, I suppose, the way we were doing it became a lot more subtle, and they were seeing the reaction the rest of the class were having to these children. They were suddenly like, well, we want to do that. And it became something all of the children wanted to go to, as opposed to interventions, which have quite a negative viewpoint from the children. This was something they all wanted to go to. Whereas if you go to an intervention in the afternoon because you didn't quite get something in the lesson, to them that's viewed as you have failed this lesson, we're giving you something extra. Whereas this was, we're raising you up beforehand.
And we had a lot of discussions early on, didn't we, with children saying, who were going, why am I out here? I'm good at maths. That's the thing. Or why am I did okay in today's lesson? Why are you taking me out? So, no, that's not what it's about. It's about helping you for tomorrow. It's that it's changed how children see
going out.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they did have a stigma with it. I think in the afternoon they'd literally be like,
I think it was really important that it was done with the teacher. As well. I think that was massive. That because you know exactly what you planned in your lesson or what you will have planned for the lesson, and so you know exactly what those children need. You know exactly what you said to them in the pre-teach.
Well, I think
that kind of raised its status as well.
Yeah, it did.
So
and also
dedicated time with your teacher.
They love that.
They love that. Yeah,
absolutely.
So always a little bit of messing around to get back to where we were. Okay. That's where we were. There we go. Okay. So those are 3 teachers on our project talking about exactly those things, about the fact that you get a different view, that the children, it changed the status. They were a group of teachers that really started to question the status of interventions actually, and how if an intervention has a low status, sending children to it lowers their status. And that was quite an interesting thing they really reflected on, just interventions generally across their school. So we've got this sort of notion that the child knows the teacher, knows that they know the mathematics as they've been in the pre-teach, and that has an impact on their participation. They take risks more. This was some of the things that happened. Our conjecture here is that the same would not be the case if the session was not run by the class teacher. So it's got to be more than just doing a pre-teach. It's not just doing a pre-teach. There is more to it than that. And I think this is the sort of big one for us as well, that again we probably could have anticipated, but we didn't necessarily, is that of course if you put this in advance of the lesson, what you're doing is you're giving children access to a lesson, which means they learn in that lesson, rather than allowing a lesson to pass where the learning hasn't happened and then putting in some intervention. You're actually increasing the time. Let's go back to the Bloom thing, given time enough, you're actually increasing the time that they have available for learning, because they're learning more in the lesson because of the pre-teach. So this was sort of the idea that there are these sort of different ways that this is having an impact beyond just they're getting some extra time. And here's a couple of quotes from teachers in the project. And so this sort of sums up exactly what we were thinking here and noticing this. You know, I love that 10-minute pre-teach. We're not talking about these pre-teachers being really long. A 10-minute pre-teach that the children get 10 minutes on the whole lesson, rather than losing a whole lesson just to access an intervention. And I think that was really where the teachers started to notice the impact of this. So the second one finding that we had that we put here is that pre-teaching and assigning competence together maximise the learning in the lessons. And again, we've got a quote from another Year 6 child there. We had some very perceptive Year 6 children involved in this, who had obviously been really struggling for quite a long time with their mathematics, but this turned things around for them. And I think this is an incredible observation by this child. And I think if you put yourself in their feet and realise that day after day after day, going into a maths lesson is like being in a race where everyone else hears the whistle and starts to run, but you don't. And what you would do in that situation, you know, if you were in a race and everyone else has heard the whistle and starts to run, do you even bother starting to run? Do you just jog lightly? Do you just sit down or walk off? It's really hard to imagine that day after day after day, when you're not hearing the whistle, that you would still run as fast as you could. And so that sort of analogy works well. We sometimes sort of call this hearing the whistle, because what we're talking about with pre-teaching is actually putting children in a position to hear the whistle. And then we've got this sort of a teacher here picking up on that start of the lesson, and giving children access to the start of the lesson became quite a crucial part of what a lot of the teachers focused on with the pre-teaching. You're not trying to cover everything in a lesson. That would be pointless. You're not trying to run the lesson. You're trying to give children access to the lesson so that they can participate in a meaningful way. And often the barrier for quite a few children is the start of the lesson, is they don't get that entry point, and therefore they haven't heard the whistle. Can we get them to hear the whistle, so that then they've got a chance of running the race, then they've got a chance of being engaged? And this really goes back to some of the things that Cohen and others wrote about. Is one of the things that we know happens in lessons is, if we've not dealt with this status thing, is we've got students coming to the tasks with higher status. They will talk more, therefore they learn more. They handle resources more. They take more control of what's going on. Their ideas are listened to and built on. And so therefore, again, they learn more, and they learn more about being a learner. So if we're losing children right at the beginning of the lesson, they're not got this opportunity to have that feeling of what they're saying being shared, being considered, being built on. They're not getting their voice heard because they don't know what their voice should be, if they don't know what the lesson's about and they don't understand. How do I come into this lesson? How do I get a voice in it? So one of the things that this seemed to do was to give those children a voice, a place to start, something to offer at the beginning that often took other children by surprise, and then they started to listen to them because they started to realise that they did have something to offer. I can see there's lots of things popping up in chat, but I'm not going to monitor chat while I'm talking. So Stephanie will alert me if there's anything that I need to interrupt this for. So again, I've just put a few quotes from children and a teacher here, just to get their sort of view on it. We did very much a sort of a 360 view, because we also asked children that weren't focused children but worked with them what they noticed, and we'll get some of their quotes later. And we also got some feedback from some parents as well, so we tried to get that sort of view from all different people. And I'm just going to play you a very short clip. It's just sound of a boy on our project just talking about this. It very much fits with what the children here are saying. And just listen really carefully to his words and how he voices how it's made a difference to him.
Okay, so do you think it's helped you coming out of the class for those?
Yeah.
Why do you think it's helped you?
Because I've been alone in a quiet area where I can concentrate.
Okay, so that's been really important, has it?
Yeah.
And do you think, because you've had that time on your own, able to concentrate, do you think that then helps you when you go back into the lesson?
Yeah, then I know a lot more like they do.
You know a lot more like they do. What do you mean like they do?
See, I would know a lot more about what we're doing in the lesson. And then I can actually understand and really do it.
You can
I love the way that he phrases that. Where he says, I know a lot more like they do. So he very much sees himself as different from the other. You know, they know what's going on in the lesson. Then I can actually be part of that lesson. And that's, you know, that's sort of coming from a child that had, you know, gone through that at the beginning of the year, was struggling with that participation, and was struggling to really know how to allow himself to think about the mathematics. He tended to just say anything because he felt that was the only way he could participate, because I don't really understand what's going on, so if I'm going to participate, I'm just going to say anything. And actually what this allowed him to do was to reason and to think and give himself time to do that, and then he was able to participate, and then he was then able to be learning along with the others. And that's sort of, I know a lot more like they do. I think that, you know, that's a little phrase that certainly stayed with me from the project. So I think this is really important, that what pre-teaching can provide children with is the possibility of getting to a solution or working right to the end of the maths lesson, which otherwise they've not been able to do. When I was working with a couple of year 2 teachers, and we in the project, and we worked on together, we planned a pre-teach together to use with the 2 groups of 3 children, and then we went and watched the children in the maths lesson that came after that. There was a bit of a gap between the pre-teach and the lesson, but then we watched them in the lesson. This was very early on in the year, and one of the year 2 teachers said, when we came out of the lesson, she said, well, they got further than they normally do. They hadn't made it to the end of the lesson. They hadn't managed to participate right to the end, but they had participated for longer. And it's a process. It's a thing that has to build over time. It's not going to be instant. But that was, you know, that's sort of the idea, that they can participate for longer. I've got them at the beginning. There's a chance, there's an opportunity here, that possibility of being able to be part of this lesson right through. So we've got another analogy here where we've used golf handicap. So if we want to, you know, if you're playing golf with people, and some people have more experience of golf and therefore get around a golf course in fewer shots than you do, in order to make it worth us playing together, what we do is we have this handicap system. And in a way, that's what pre-teach is doing. It's giving you some extra, so that when you're coming into the lesson, you have a chance of engaging that lesson in the same way as the other children. You're not already at the end point, you're ready to engage with the lesson along with everybody else. And that was something we had to keep reminding people. In the second year, this is one of the things that one of the teachers leading in the whole school sort of fed back to us, that one of the things they were finding working with other teachers was that some of them had been sort of focusing on memory, and that didn't really work for pre-teaching. That's not really what it's about. It's better to focus on conceptual understanding, on language, on how's this lesson going to start? What are going to be the things that puzzle you at the beginning of the lesson? Let's just make sense of those. Oh, we haven't used this resource for a long time. Let's all just handle it now and remind ourselves of how it works. Let's remind ourselves of some of the language we're going to be using. It's that sort of, what are the barriers to getting into the lesson? So we're not focusing on answers to questions, you know, can you remember what's half of 16? But we're going to be exploring the meaning of a half, or what do we understand about a half? So we've got that entry point into the lesson. Our third finding here is that it had a positive impact on children's confidence in themselves as thinkers. And I did sort of say to all the teachers, because they were all saying confidence, and I said, well, that's really woolly. We have to really pin this down and get something that's a bit more, you know, let's really sort of get down to, what do you mean when you say confidence? And this was the list of things that they came up with that demonstrated that there was a change in confidence. So that engagement from the start. These children were no longer passive. They were offering contributions. They were ready to respond. Not only that, they asked questions, and they were seeking out a challenge. They were much more independent, accessing resources independently, prepared to explain their thinking, able and prepared to support others. They weren't passive in conversations, they were active, and also they were noticing this change in behaviour and attitude outside the classroom, outside of the maths lesson. It carried itself elsewhere. I've got lots of lovely clips of the teachers talking about it, but I've already noticed it's 22 minutes to 5, so I haven't really got much longer. I'm going to zip through a few of the slides here. But I love this one. I always put my hands up now, even if I'm not 100% sure, as I want to know if I'm right or not. That's a massive turnaround for a child that previously was passively sat, not putting their hand up, and the only thing they were checking was, am I right? Yeah, okay, I've got through that. And I think there's some really obvious things that the children are noticing, but the year 6 child at the bottom there, it helps to explain it to someone because you know and they don't, and then it helps you understand it even more when you explain it to them. So it isn't just about, I've put you in a position where you can now explain things to other children. I put you in that position, you learn more because through that active explaining, you are learning more and understanding more deeply. So again, that's a way that other children who are used to explaining to different people are learning. They learn through the active explanation. We're putting more children in that position by doing this. And this is where we've got some of the people who are not the focused children, but their observations. Again, I particularly like that top one with the year 3 child who was just the partner of the focused child. He used to agree with everything. You know, that nodding dog syndrome. You know what you're talking about. I don't really, so I'll just sit here and agree. But now we have discussions about the maths. So we were really sort of seeing that confidence thing. We thought at the outset what we were going to find out was when you should do a pre-teaching, how long it should last, where in the day, where before the lesson, what it should focus on. And actually what we found out is it can have different structures and it can focus on different things, but you need to focus on removing the barriers for the children accessing the lesson, and it needs to be the class teacher doing it. Those are the things that we looked at. So they're about providing that access to the lesson, and really you want to identify one thing. Don't try and do everything. You're doing one thing that allows the children, you're opening that door for them. So those things often included these. So exploring how the lesson is going to start so you can just get through the door and hear the whistle. Rehearsing language. We know that we've got children who are being exposed. We've got a lot of children coming into school from very young and then coming through school who are not getting exposed to as much language as we might like. So rehearsing language and exploring language and having that chance to use the language was often a part of pre-teachers. If there was going to be a new topic, a new context, a new resource, then that often new things are the thing that throw children and then they've lost their place in the lesson. So those might be explored in the pre-teach. It might be just a rehearsing. You do know these things. Let's just access that prior learning you're going to use in the lesson. And it might be more generally around images and resources. That's sort of some of the things that people did. So we are assuming that it is every child's right to struggle in a maths lesson because that's where the learning is going to happen, but you don't want to be struggling to access the lesson. So we're removing those barriers so we can access the lesson and then we struggle alongside everybody. I have put something in bold there because this is what might be the case sometimes, that the biggest barrier might be the teacher's belief in the child in the lesson, because what we saw was teachers completely changed the way they thought about the children, and then the children's participation in the lesson changed. So I think that was really interesting. We haven't got very long left for me to talk here, so I'm not going to go over these examples. Let's just skip through those. One of the issues we had arising, particularly when we got to the whole school level and we weren't working so closely with individual teachers, were project teachers finding that some of their teachers were trying to cover everything that was needed for the lesson in the pre-teach, and then they were exposing gaps, and then they were going, oh, I can't do this, you can't do it in a pre-teach, and that's not the idea. So being specific, thinking very carefully about the purpose of the pre-teach was really important. Very briefly, in terms of the mechanics, we had the same children for a whole year because we felt it was something that was important, but during that year quite a few teachers had additional children join their groups, but that's one thing that teachers have to explore and decide. Most of the teachers we worked with had pre-teaching on the same day. The Key Stage 2 teachers really liked a gap between because it allowed them to think about what they were going to change in their lessons, and this was one of the big things that happened, was teachers adjusted their lessons and therefore taught a better lesson, because of the pre-teach. That's another way the learning was improved. Key Stage 1 teachers tended to like it just before the lesson, because then it kind of helped the children just take that learning through, and it was a bit of a journey. The length varied. As I said, somebody earlier was saying 10 minutes. I think a lot of them were around 15 minutes, but some were just a few minutes. It was, you know, just about saying, right, let's just very quickly look at this and make sure that you know what this is and what we're going to look at today, and that you're not thrown when you see this calculation. And again, we didn't put any particular demands on the frequency. Most did it 2 or 3 times a week, and it needs to be regular enough for it to have that sort of impact. So I think 2 was very common. 3 was sort of like lovely. We had one school that was trying to do it every day, and I said to them I thought that was probably not a good idea, because in a school you can never do something every day, so it's quite a good idea not to set yourself up with that. And so if it's successful, then we've got understanding in the lesson. We are being active and influential. What I haven't really looked at, and we haven't really got time to go into in any depth, is the trickiest part, and that is assigning competence. It's a powerful tool, more challenging for teachers to use effectively. So this is this bring attention to something that a learner has to offer to all of us, that can actually, we can all learn from, and we can all take into our own understanding, and bringing attention to that in that public way. It needs to be intellectual, it needs to be specific, and it needs to be relevant. We had a lot of clunkiness at the start with what we were doing, but I'm just going to show this slide, which is an example that I saw in a classroom when I was observing. And actually it was something that happened when I was observing with the class teachers, so we could just observe the 3 focus children at the beginning of the year, and the lesson was being taught by the subject leader. But the subject leader sort of had really got his head around assigning competence, and he particularly he knew the focus children, so he did some things in the lesson to help us with watching them. We had this child that was very passive. This was the nodding dog child. So when they turned to their partner, they behaved beautifully. They looked at them, they nodded, they looked like they were interested, they didn't say a single word. They offered nothing. So they didn't speak at all. So the teacher had a problem on the board, and this was year 1 or year 2, I think it was year 2, and had asked another child for their thought, went directly to this child and asked her. She answered the teacher, and the teacher wrote her response on the board and said, I think this is going to be really useful. Then moved on, talked to some other children, and then went back to what this child had said. And there was something even more powerful than if he had stopped at what she'd said and said, oh yes, use this, that he had continued looking to see if anybody had anything better, and nobody had anything better than she had. And it was really useful. So he went back to it and he asked them all to focus on it. When they were asked to talk the next time, she was completely animated. She was pointing at things, she was talking to her partner, she was explaining, and her whole behaviour in that lesson changed because of that assigning competence. He had identified that she had offered something they could all use and learn from, and they could. He had made that public, it was specific, it was relevant, and her whole engagement in that lesson changed at that point. I'm going to just go from that. So assigning competence is about drawing attention to a child's understanding that everyone can learn from. It's not about drawing attention to a child by getting them to perform. That's where it can backfire. That's where it can be very clunky. It's about saying, you've understood something, let's share that understanding because we can all learn from it. So it's not you, it's your bit of understanding. But therefore, that then raises the status of that child, because everybody's starting to go, they've got something I can learn from. So it's about being explicit about their contribution that's of intellectual value. I'll just let you read that slide. I'm going to finish with just a couple of things. I've gone slightly over my time. So we're still working on assigning competence and really getting that working. And I know the teachers that we worked with, that was something that we were all together refining and sort of working on it. But it seems to have quite a lot of potential. And it has been suggested to me that there's a PhD ready to be done around assigning competence. So if there's anybody in this meeting that would be interested in doing that, that's a suggestion that came from somebody who'd listened to one of our talks about this. So you can't set up assigning competence through the pre-teach. What we're hoping is, because the teachers know the children better and have a better relationship and know their understanding, they are listening out for that child and what they have to offer, but they've also put that child in a better place to offer something, and therefore assigning competence becomes something that is much more likely to happen. Okay, so I'm going back to the very start, just as I come to a close here, which is about saying what our project was about. Our project was about helping the children to be active and influential participants in lessons. It was not tick off that we've run a pre-teach and tick off we did some assigning competence. So the focus is on the learners learning, not what the teachers are doing. Oh yeah, I've done my pre-teach, I've done whatever. If the pre-teach is not having that impact, it's not doing what we want it to do, and that's really essential. We realised we had spent too often in research projects working on sort of interventions where we seemed to be making a real difference to learners in those sessions, and they were taking none of it into the classroom, and that's a real wasted opportunity. So this for us really joined those two things up. It is really important to say this, that as well as those teachers working on pre-teaching, assigning competence, that they were involved in professional development for that year as well. So it gave them access to a sustained bit of professional development, which had a direct impact on their work. And the teachers, when they reflected on it, identified a couple of things that they said were really important and had a real impact on them. One was that we used collaborative lesson research cycles in the lesson, including one that included the whole group being there to watch a pre-teach and a lesson. So we had about 40 teachers or 40 people together for that. And the other was having that support of an external, I'm going to call it knowledgeable other. That comes from sort of collaborative lesson research language, but the maths advisor being very much there as a support and being able to work with them. So the work that we did in that project had that very significant professional development element for teachers. Not going to linger on that. Here I'm going to say are some of the challenges. I've sort of mentioned the first one a couple of times. This is my last slide before the references. Teachers' beliefs, teachers' interest, teachers' willingness to experiment. It was a research project. They needed to be prepared to do this. So our first year, our teachers really got on board with it because they basically signed up to it. It was much harder in the second year where it was whole schools and where teachers in those schools didn't necessarily have a shared belief, interest or willingness to experiment. So there's things there that's about the culture of learning for teachers in schools as well, and that's the focus being on creating equitable classrooms. Do we all believe in that as an aim, and have we got that sort of shared understanding of it? There are issues and challenges around whole school status of intervention that I mentioned early on, and understanding and expectations of this senior leadership team if we're going to make this work at a sort of a wider than an individual level. I know there's quite a few schools that have started looking at this at a whole school level, and I've sort of encouraged them to write up what they do and make that available so people can learn more. I'll send the slides to everybody that's here today. You'll get the slides, and you've got the list of references there. So really, so that's just to tell you, sorry, our next one, we haven't decided what the focus is. If there's someone in this group that would like to do the next talk, please do contact me. We're planning it for December the 10th at the same time. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop recording, and then we're quite a small group. So actually, there's 48 chat messages that I've missed. Let me just stop the recording first.